2 hours. Then everything reverses. That was all he said. No yelling. No outbursts. No fists slamming the table. Just a sentence, simple, chilling, final. Dropped like a bomb into a boardroom that had already decided he wasn't worth listening to. Malik Johnson stood tall at the head of a room where every face pretended not to see him. A black CEO in a room full of white decision-makers who had already moved on before he'd even sat down. The Neurolytics boardroom was modern, glass-walled, dripping with tech wealth. But beneath the polished surface, the air was stale with something older, prejudice dressed as policy. Malik didn't need to read the room. He'd written this scene in his mind a dozen times. They were going to fire him. Not because the numbers were bad. He'd grown revenue by 240% in 3 years. He'd landed the biggest contract in company history. But the truth was uglier. Too confident. Too self-assured. Too visible. Too black. "We appreciate your service," Gerald Whitmore, the chairman, said without looking up. "But the board has voted. Effective immediately, your role as CEO is terminated." Silence. Then a chuckle from the corner. "Let's just say this experiment ran its course." Malik blinked once. Then he reached into his inside jacket pocket, took out his phone, and pressed one number. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't change his tone. "Do it. All of it. Now." He hung up. Slid the phone onto the table like a closing argument. Someone scoffed. "Was that your lawyer?" Malik turned toward the exit. 2 hours, he said clearly. Then everything reverses. Security stepped forward. No one stopped them. The board smirked. This was done. But what none of them knew was that Malik hadn't just run the company. He had architected it. Clause by clause. Contract by contract. And what they had just cut loose was the keystone. What happened next wouldn't make headlines because it was loud. It would make history because it was designed. This isn't just a downfall story. It's a blueprint. Let's begin. Malik Johnson had walked into that boardroom a dozen times before. But this time, the air felt different. The room was chilled just a few degrees too cold, the way corporate spaces often are to keep people alert or uncomfortable. The overhead lights were bright enough to reflect off every polished surface, every glass panel, every stainless steel accent. But somehow, the energy was dimmer than ever. No one looked up when he entered. No greetings. No eye contact. Not even a nod of acknowledgement. The boardroom at Neurolytics was the kind of place that made statements without saying a word. The 20-foot table was carved from reclaimed walnut, flown in from somewhere expensive. The art on the walls was minimal but curated, black and white prints of bridges, of architecture, of control. Every chair cost more than most people's rent. But none of that could cover the quiet truth floating in the room. He didn't belong here. Not really. Not in their eyes. He had been CEO for nearly 5 years. He had brought them out of near bankruptcy. He had secured international partnerships, expanded operations, rebuilt engineering. But to them, he was still an outlier. A PR story that had overstayed its welcome. Malik walked slowly to his usual seat at the head of the table. Not a single chair shifted to greet him. One board member glanced at his Rolex. Another pretended to read the executive summary in front of him, flipping pages that had already been read. The air felt like glass, ready to shatter with one wrong move. But Malik didn't move raw. He didn't even sit. He stood at the edge of the table, hands calmly resting on the chair back. His gaze swept the room, steady, silent, clinical. He met each set of eyes, and when they refused to meet his, he moved on. One by one. There was no anger in his face. Just clarity. This wasn't disappointment. It was confirmation. He knew what today was. He had written the contingency plan for it over a year ago. But still, there was a sting. Not from losing a title, but from witnessing, yet again, How quickly excellence is erased when it doesn't come in the expected form. They weren't going to say it. They didn't have to. But he heard it loud and clear in every glance they refused to give. Too bold. Too sharp. Too much. Too black. And that was the real reason they'd called this meeting. By the time Malik stepped out of the building, Seattle's sky had started to darken. Too early in the day for the sun to be setting, but just right for a storm to be brewing. He didn't rush. He didn't look back at the glass tower of Neurolytics, where his name had once sat etched on the executive directory plaque. He simply walked. Calm. Centered. As he moved down the rain-speckled sidewalk, people passed by with earbuds in, coffee cups in hand, no idea what had just happened 5 floors above them. But inside Malik's coat pocket, the spark had already been lit. That call, 6 words long, wasn't just a reaction. It was a trigger. He turned onto a side street and entered a building far less flashy than Neurolytics headquarters. No marble floors. No concierge. Just a matte black door marked with a discreet plaque. Mosaic 8. To the world, it was a private analytics consultancy. To Malik, it was the blueprint. Inside, the lights were low, the walls lined with digital screens, dashboards tracking everything from stock fluctuations to internal system logs. It was sleek, quiet, and alive. Tasha, his longtime confidant and now COO of Mosaic 8, was already waiting. She didn't ask what happened. She already knew. It started, Malik said as he stepped in. Andre, lead architect of Mosaic Security Systems, swiveled in his chair. We've seen early movement. Eurasia's servers pinged at 10:47 a.m. Miritex exec Slack had 3 flagged messages with your name. Reina, head of legal, stood near the back, arms crossed, calm as ever. And a video. Someone inside the boardroom leaked it. It's online. How bad is it? Malik asked. Viral, she replied. Bad for them. Excellent for us. They moved quickly, without panic. These weren't people caught off guard. They were people working a plan. The screens lit up with social media heat maps, hashtags beginning to trend. Hashtag reverse by design. Hashtag the Malik clause. And most damning of all, a 10-second clip of a board member laughing. This experiment ran its course. No one spoke for a moment. Then Tasha asked, "You ready?" Malik nodded. "I've been ready. They just gave me the green light." With a tap on the touch screen, she activated the network protocols. Across servers, across time zones, across contracts, they began to move. The storm wasn't coming. It had already arrived. They just hadn't felt it yet. Deep inside Mosaic 8's war room, the real heartbeat wasn't on the screens, it was buried in the contracts. Thousands of pages. Hundreds of deals. Years in the making. Each one written with surgical precision. Each one signed, approved, archived, and forgotten. By everyone, except Malik. He hadn't just negotiated contracts. He had authored them with intention. Every major deal Neurolytics had secured over the past 4 years, especially the ones that saved them from financial collapse, had Malik's fingerprints all over them. But what the board never noticed, or maybe never bothered to read closely, was that those deals came with something else. A clause. Clause 72. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even unusual. Just a single paragraph buried in legal language most executives skimmed. But it mattered. In short, Clause 72 stated, in the event of an unplanned or unilateral termination of the chief executive officer without a pre-approved succession plan agreed upon in writing by all named stakeholders, this contract shall be considered null and void, and all deliverables, services, and strategic access will be suspended pending arbitration. Simple. And absolutely devastating. Because they had just fired Malik without warning. No plan. No advisory vote. No approval from partners. And those partners, they were reading Clause 72 right now. Tasha pulled up a secured server log. Eurasia Ventures sent a notification to their in-house counsel 15 minutes ago. Subject line, immediate review, termination clause. Andre added, Miratech is next. Their compliance team flagged the boardroom video. Malik stayed quiet, watching the alerts blink across the dashboard. One by one, deals began entering critical status. Red flags. Warnings. Notifications. They weren't just losing contracts, they were about to be legally frozen out of their own infrastructure. Because many of those deals didn't just involve funding. They involved back-end access, operational APIs, and co-owned data layers. And Mosaic 8 already had the infrastructure to replace every one of them. Malik finally spoke. How long before the dominoes fall? Tasha replied, some are already tipping. Clause 72 wasn't revenge. It was accountability, designed in plain sight. And now, the very ink they had used to cut him out was becoming the weapon they'd handed him. A quiet weapon. One line in a contract. And the clock had already started. Inside the Neurolytics headquarters, the storm was invisible, but it was spreading fast. To the outside world, everything still looked polished, calm, functional. But on the 17th floor, in a glass-walled executive suite, panic had taken root. Emails started bouncing. Servers glitched. Internal systems stalled mid-process without explanation. Then the first call came in, from Eurasia Ventures. Short, terse, final. Due to the unauthorized termination of the CEO without proper notification or transition protocol, all agreements are suspended pending arbitration. Effective immediately. The executive team froze. What's Clause 72? Someone whispered. No one answered. 3 minutes later, Miratech scrubbed Neurolytics from their website. Publicly. With a statement. Neurolytics was no longer listed as a partner. No comment. No explanation. Just erasure. Inside the boardroom, Gerald Whitmore stood up fast, nearly knocking over his chair. His voice rose, barely controlled. This is sabotage, he barked. He planned this. From the back, someone muttered. He warned us. The board tried to regain control. Frantic calls to legal, to PR, to their partners. But most of the phones rang unanswered. The ones who did answer. They weren't angry. They were prepared. Check your contracts, one lawyer said bluntly. You signed this. Downstairs, word spread faster than memos. Interns gathered near coffee machines, whispering. Engineers refreshed dashboards showing real-time partner statuses, all blinking red. The video of Malik's firing had already crossed 6 million views. It showed the smirks, the silence, the words, he was an experiment. And then his final line, 2 hours. Then, everything reverses. That line became the title of every article that followed. By lunchtime, a Bloomberg headline read, Neurolytics CEO ousted. Collapse follows in real time. Across social media, users dissected every second of the boardroom video. Screenshots of executives were turned into memes. One post read, they fired the future, and the future fired back. Within 6 hours, the company had lost 3 of its top 5 contracts. By the end of the day, 2 more followed. And every single one of them cited the same reason, Clause 72. What started with a sentence had become a structural failure. Not because Malik Johnson shouted, but because he never had to. He wrote it all down, and they never read it. The truth was, they had been warned. Not once, not subtly, but in detail, in writing, on record. 9 months before the boardroom ambush, Malik had submitted a document titled Strategic Risk Mitigation, Leadership Continuity Clauses and Operational Dependencies. It was 27 pages long, annotated, indexed, with executive summaries. He had emailed it directly to every board member, including Gerald Whitmore. Twice. He had attached it to the quarterly operations packet. He'd even brought it up, casually but clearly, during a governance meeting. Neurolytics has evolved beyond personalities, he had said. But not beyond people. If we forget that, the structure becomes brittle. No one responded. They nodded, smiled, moved on. The memo included a breakdown of every major contract he had overseen, each one including Clause 72 or a variation of it. The document clearly outlined the risk of violating those clauses without a transition framework. One section read, "Termination of the CEO without prior approval from core strategic partners may result in cascading partnership failures, financial exposure, and regulatory vulnerabilities." But to the board, it looked like overkill. Or worse, like ego. Gerald had once dismissed the memo in private conversation, waving a hand and muttering, "It reads like he's daring us to fire him." Another board member had called it paranoid policy padding. But Raina from Mosaic 8 had seen the response emails. She had tracked the metadata. She knew exactly what happened. They didn't miss it, she told Tasha. They ignored it. They chose not to read what made them uncomfortable. And now, every page of that ignored document was coming true, line by line, consequence by consequence. Inside the legal wing at Neurolytics, junior attorneys scrambled to find archived files. One finally found Malik's memo, timestamped, "Read receipt pending." The file had been marked internally as non-actionable, with a note that said, "No immediate board relevance. Revisit only if leadership transition becomes necessary." The irony hit hard, because by the time they revisited it, there was nothing left to save. Clause 72 wasn't hidden. It was highlighted. The risks weren't buried. They were bolded. But the board had made a decision long ago, not just to fire Malik Johnson, but to underestimate him. And now, every alarm he rang was echoing back, louder than ever. But no one was left to hit the mute button. By the end of the second day, the silence inside the boardroom wasn't strategic, it was fractured. Cracks had formed. Not in the company. Not yet. But in the board itself. What had once been a unified wall of polished confidence was now a table full of whispers, accusations, and avoidance. Gerald Whitmore sat at the head, shoulders tight, jaw clenched. He hadn't slept. The bags under his eyes were no longer hidden by power. They were lit up by guilt, or fear. No one knew who to blame. So they blamed each other. "Why wasn't Clause 72 flagged earlier?" snapped Don Feldman, the finance chair. "I brought it up months ago," said Harriet Lowe, director of legal compliance. "You waved it off." Gerald shot her a look. "And you didn't push harder." A young associate from HR slipped into the room with a printout, "Social media analytics." Hashtag the Malik clause had topped 18 million mentions. The board's faces were being turned into memes. Their quotes captioned in bold black text. This experiment ran its course. Sienna Blake, the only woman of color on the board, stood up slowly. Her voice was low, but it carried. "Do you realize what this looks like?" she asked. "What it really is?" No one answered. "You didn't just fire him," she said. "You humiliated him. On video." With smug smiles and silence, Gerald muttered something, but she cut him off. "You sat at this very table and judged him, not by his performance, but by your discomfort." Her voice broke slightly, but she didn't stop. "You dismissed the best CEO this company ever had because he didn't look like the mold you were used to." She paused, then added, "And now that mold is cracking. And all you care about is the optics." No one could look her in the eye. A few minutes later, she walked out of the boardroom. No resignation letter. No press statement. Just silence. But outside, the media had already caught wind. Reporters gathered. A leak revealed internal emails showing Malik's memo had been marked low priority. Stakeholders began demanding answers. The boardroom that once ruled with unspoken control now echoed with doubt. And every chair at the table felt a little less secure. Not because Malik Johnson had shouted, but because his silence was proving louder than any voice they had ever heard. At Mosaic 8, the tone was different. There was no cheering, no clapping, No high fives or celebratory posts. Because this wasn't about revenge. It never had been. Inside the main operations room, Malik stood at the edge of a long table. Screens surrounded him, displaying cascading alerts, social mentions, contract terminations, investor fallout, all real, all rapid. But he wasn't smiling. He wasn't even satisfied. He turned to the team. "We don't dance on rubble," he said calmly. "We build what they thought couldn't exist." Tasha nodded, arms crossed, focused. Andre scanned the dashboards without saying a word. Reina updated timelines for infrastructure migration, contracts, and pending NDAs. This wasn't a takedown. It was a takeover. Not of their name. Of their space. Mosaic 8 had been designed for this moment, not to humiliate, but to replace. Every tool, every platform, every protocol Malik had ever helped build at Neurolytics had been rebuilt better, smarter, safer. Now it was time to release the next layer. Aegis Lens is ready, Tasha confirmed. We can deploy across all sectors that had ties to the old network. It'll take less than 72 hours. Aegis Lens wasn't just software. It was an ethical operating system, built to track organizational decision-making, highlight bias points, and simulate consequence before policy became damage. Malik looked at the product logo on the screen. Simple. Quiet. Push it, he said. Across the globe, dormant servers began to light up. Partners who had quietly reached out to Mosaic, vendors, non-profits, government agencies, even former Neurolytics clients, were now offered a seamless migration path. No drama. No press release. Just a better option. Outside, media headlines tried to spin the story as a tech retaliation. But inside Mosaic, no one was talking about Neurolytics anymore. They were talking about what comes next. Malik walked the hallway alone, passing teams who were too focused to look up. That was exactly how he wanted it. No distractions. Just design. Reina caught up with him. Investors want to know when you'll address the collapse. I won't, Malik said simply. That's their story. She nodded. So what's ours? He paused. Ours is about building something resilient, he said. Not to hurt them, but to prove that we never needed them to begin with. Then he added, almost under his breath, revenge is loud. Legacy is quiet. And with that, he stepped into the next room. Not to destroy what failed, but to deliver what endures. It didn't take long for the federal government to take notice. By the third day, the collapse of Neurolytics was no longer just a corporate crisis, it was a national concern. The Securities and Exchange Commission sent an official inquiry to the company's legal department. Within hours, the Department of Justice followed with a subpoena for internal communications, contracts, and governance policies. Clause 72 had gone viral. Not just in headlines, but in legal circles. On Capitol Hill, lawmakers whispered about it in committee chambers. Could this one clause really collapse a billion-dollar tech firm in under a week? Apparently, yes. But it wasn't the clause that caused the damage. It was the culture that ignored it. At Mosaic 8, Reina fielded the first round of federal calls. The tone wasn't aggressive. It was curious. What was the purpose of Clause 72? One official asked. To protect the people connected to the system, she replied. Not the system itself. That answer ended up in a dozen government briefings. News outlets began calling it the Johnson Protocol, an accountability clause written not to punish a company, but to protect everyone depending on it from a boardroom's worst decisions. Think tanks published white papers. Law schools hosted emergency panels. The Harvard Business Review released a feature titled, When Governance Ignores Its Own Warning Labels. Meanwhile, Malik stayed quiet. He didn't appear on television. He declined interview requests. But his silence only amplified the signal. Because every article had to mention him. Every expert had to reference the memo he wrote, the one the board ignored. Back in D.C., a bipartisan ethics committee released a draft bill proposing new corporate governance standards. Among the suggestions, mandatory contract transparency, third-party review of CEO termination clauses, and enforceable succession protocols. The working title? The Resilience Act. Raina shared the draft with Malik, sliding the packet across his desk without a word. He read it slowly, then said, "They're not trying to legislate power. They're trying to catch up to what it looks like when power respects accountability." She nodded. "And you gave them a blueprint." In that moment, the game had changed. Not just for Neurolytics. Not just for Mosaic. But for every company that ever thought contracts were paperwork instead of promises. Because now, the bar wasn't profit. It was principle. By the end of the week, Malik Johnson's name had disappeared from every directory inside the Neurolytics building. His bio was scrubbed from the company's website. His access badge, already deactivated, was mailed back to Mosaic 8 in a plain envelope. No letter. No explanation. But it didn't matter. Because legacy isn't carved into marble. It's written into memory. Into systems that keep working long after your name is gone. At Mosaic 8, Malik walked the floor in his usual way, quiet, steady, observant. People didn't stop him to praise. They just kept building. And that was the point. In the lobby, a new digital wall was being installed. It didn't feature portraits or leadership quotes. Instead, it displayed real-time metrics, ethics compliance, stakeholder impact, equity audit scores. No signatures. No founders' names. Just results. Back in his office, Malik sat down with a small stack of letters, handwritten notes from employees, interns, and even former Neurolytics staff. Some thanked him. Some apologized. Some just said, "I get it now." He didn't post them. He didn't share them. He just read each one. And then placed them in a drawer labeled not feedback, but fuel. Outside, articles continued to swirl. News anchors still speculated. Analysts still debated Clause 72. But the story had already shifted. It was no longer about what Malik had destroyed. It was about what he made impossible to ignore. An op-ed in the Washington Post captured it best. He didn't burn the building down. He flipped the breaker and made everyone realize they'd been working in the dark. At Neurolytics, a new CEO had been appointed, bland, temporary, expected. Investors didn't celebrate. Partners didn't re-engage. Because no one trusted the structure anymore. It wasn't just broken. It had been exposed. Meanwhile, Malik's name trended for the 8th day straight. But he didn't speak. He didn't need to. His team did the talking. His code carried the message. His contracts carried the weight. And the systems he helped design, they were still running. Legacy doesn't always come with applause. Or monuments. Or headlines. Sometimes, legacy is the space you leave behind, so others can build without fear. And if done right, they won't need to remember your name. They'll remember the standard. It didn't happen all at once. There were no fireworks. No headlines screaming victory. No viral videos. Just a quiet spread. Like water through cracks. Aegis Lens, the ethical infrastructure platform Malik and his team had built, was adopted by its first major government agency within 3 weeks. Then came a school district. Then a healthcare network. None of them announced it publicly. They didn't need to. Because the product wasn't built for publicity. It was built for protection. Inside each contract, Clause 72 had evolved. It wasn't just about leadership anymore. It was about organizational memory. About accountability that didn't wait for a scandal to react. About systems that asked the hard questions before someone else had to. Tech companies started calling it the Malik Clause. At first, it was a quiet joke in legal departments, something they referenced when drafting C-suite protections. But soon, it became serious. Major firms revised their executive contracts. They added ethical fail-safes. They held internal reviews, not because of compliance, but because of consequence. Law firms hosted webinars. Business schools rewrote case studies. One class at MIT even built a simulation tool around Clause 72, calling it governance by design. And still, Malik said nothing. He didn't attend panels. He didn't sign endorsement deals. He didn't monetize the movement. Because this was never about attention. It was about endurance. At a high school in Oakland, a teacher shared Malik's story with her civics class. Not the collapse, but the blueprint. She printed the clause and taped it to the whiteboard. A student raised her hand and asked, "Do we have this in government?" The teacher smiled. Not yet. At Mosaic 8, the data wall lit up with new activations every hour. Cities, non-profits, small startups, even one Fortune 500 company, anonymously, migrated their compliance systems to Aegis Lens. Malik stood at the edge of the operations floor and watched it all unfold. No speeches, no grand announcement, just systems working the way they were supposed to. Raina joined him, holding a short message that had just come in from a 14-year-old boy in North Carolina. It read, "I used to think people like me couldn't run companies. Now I'm writing my first contract." Malik read the message, smiled faintly, and said, "That's it." That was the point. Change didn't need to be loud. It just needed to last. Some stories end with applause. Some with a courtroom verdict. Or a headline. Or a legacy etched in stone. But this story, it ends with a system that refuses to collapse. Because the real lesson Malik Johnson left behind wasn't about power. Or contracts. Or even justice. It was about design. He didn't fight to be heard. He built something that couldn't be ignored. And when the silence got loud, it wasn't anger that carried his voice, it was structure. What we learn from him is simple but deep. If the place you're standing can erase you overnight, build something that can stand without you. Because real leadership is not about control. It's about construction. It's about creating systems that ask hard questions, challenge unfair rules, and keep standing even when the people inside them fall. So wherever you are, whatever role you hold, maybe you're leading a team, building a company, raising a family, or just trying to find your own space in a room that wasn't designed for you. Ask yourself, what would your Clause 72 look like? What values would you embed in the systems around you? Not to retaliate, but to protect. Not to punish, but to preserve. Because one day, the system will be tested. And when it is, your silence or your design will speak. So let us ask you, what would you write into your future? What would your legacy say, without your name on it? If this story moved you, we invite you to leave a comment below. What part hit you hardest? What would your Clause 72 protect? And if you're ready to explore more true stories of quiet power, systems that outlast silence, and justice designed to endure, subscribe now. Because the next story, it's already being written.